Hey everybody, welcome to Earth and Time, a channel where we check out both human as well as Earth history and specifically where the two intersect. And today I'm coming to you from just south of San Francisco. I'm in the town of Pacifica right now. I just recently landed at SFO, San Francisco Airport, worked my way over here to Highway 101, Pacific Coast Highway, and I'm going to take that down for a certain portion of the coastline here that you can see behind me, and I'm going to go check out some things like landslides, going to check out some things like the San Andreas Fault, and talk a little bit about the unique provinces here and the unique geology along Highway 101. So with that being said, let's get to it. I need to get some food, so my first stop, of course, is a place called Dinosaurs, and they do an amazing banh mi. All right, so here's the menu. I love that it's Dinosaurs, and they have so many good things. So I'm getting the grilled pork and then getting some spring rolls. All right, I know I have the sun behind me. It's the only seat I could grab, but take a look at all this yummy goodness. Got myself a Thai iced tea. Take a look at that thing. That's a banh mi. So it's got grilled pork inside, jalapenos, pickled carrots, cucumbers, absolutely awesome. And of course, I can never go to a place that serves banh mi without trying their spring rolls as well. And these are their chicken spring rolls. So excited. Okay, now that I've had my sandwich, I want to show you all what this amazing coastline looks like and talk a little bit about the geology. I'm going to zoom in here where we can see a little bit more of the cliffs, and there's a couple of things going on here I want to talk about when we talk about geology. One, along here on the Pacific coast, we're just south of San Francisco, they've actually built this seawall here with these rocks to try to forego more erosion. So all these homes, this whole neighborhood in here is all at risk of tumbling down into the sea. In fact, you can see the cliffs off in the distance that are very sharp and are slowly eroding back. So as these waves are coming, they're just hammering on here. Shoreline erosion is a real serious deal here along the Pacific coast of California. One of the other things we can see way out here are what are known as haystacks, or rocks that sit out in the middle of the ocean where everything's been eroded around them for various reasons, and they're all that is surviving out there. So famous haystacks, if anybody's ever seen the Goonies movie, that's probably some of the most famous haystacks that you'll see, but you can actually see those out here in Pacifica as well. Now, for the general geologic province, we're in a really unique situation here. We're actually on the Pacific plate as I stand here on this pier. Now, what's special about that is I only have to go a handful of miles, less than 10 kilometers over that hill, and I'm actually in the North American plate. Those hills that we're looking at setting up here are set up due to the San Andreas Fault system. So we're actually going to take a look at that today as we travel along Pacific Coast Highway. We're going to actually hop over those mountains and actually go to what's known as Fault Line Park and see if we can learn a little bit more about the San Andreas Fault and see some of the areas where the 1906 rupture took place. But before I go anywhere, the sheer magnitude of these waves, are just intense. These waves have to be 6, 7 feet, 8 feet tall, coming and crashing down here. Absolutely spectacular. One of the other things I'll mention as I'm walking off the pier here in Pacifica is the terrain we're actually sitting in is pretty unique as well. So the rocks that make up this area are a combination of ocean rocks, old volcanoes, and actually pieces of Southern California that have gotten dragged all the way up here over the last 10 plus million years due to the San Andreas Fault Zone. Pretty unique story and pretty fascinating piece of the continent here just south of San Francisco. Okay, let's work our way heading south, where we're going to work that direction and see what we can learn about the amazing geology here. Loving the murals in this town too. So you can see the ocean mural here, and it looks like a fun stop. So let's go check it out. Look, they have a really cool sketch of a trilobite and some other dinosaur skulls. Oh, and check out this artwork. This is amazing. I will put the information for this artist and for this place up for you all, so you can check out these prints. And he has one of my favorites, a Dimetrodon. And we had a conversation before how about Dimetrodons are not dinosaurs. They're actually more related to mammals than they are dinosaurs. They're actually synapsids, which led to thrapsids that eventually led to the mammals. Pretty cool, right? That is an awesome picture. He's got the trilobite killer here. And fish. Cotton crustacean. $10 intervals. Really, really cool shot. Well, I have to say that was one of the best small town finds in a really long time. Pull into Pacifica, check out cotton crustacean. Super unique items. Absolutely an amazing place to stumble across. I'm so happy I stopped and walked in. I got myself a trilobite shirt and I got this Daring to Dig Adventures of Women in American Paleontology book. Looks really interesting. I'm really excited to check it out. So there's a really interesting feature right up here that's known as Sam's Castle. And this house was actually built in 1908, post the 1906 earthquake that everybody, I'm sure, learned about, that destroyed San Francisco. But it was done by a railroad tycoon. He built this house in 1908 and said it was earthquake proof. It became known as Sam's Castle, and you can see how it's got a castle design. It's based on the railroad tycoon's wife's hometown in Scotland, a castle from there. And so it has that classic architecture with the turrets on top. But it became known as Sam's Castle in 1959 when a gentleman named Sam Meza ended up buying it. And apparently they do tours there. Unfortunately, they're not open today. All right, so my next stop here in Pacifica is actually to take a look at the quarry here. And it's on this trail they call the Quarry Trail, or Quarry Running Trail. So the quarry here is really important for the greater San Francisco area. They got a lot of building material out of this quarry here. So San Francisco's, I don't know, 10, 12 miles up the road from here, the downtown portion. So they would have had to truck that material back and forth. But I want to take you all to take a look at this quarry, which is supposedly this limestone. So let's go take a look. Along the way, they have these amazing gardens, and you see Pacifica's Liberty Garden here, and this is pretty spectacular. And it looks like people have decorated along the trail with all kinds of flowers and memorials. Really, really nice. And it looks like the whole community comes out and helps chip in on making this garden possible. It's really moving seeing how they've created this, what they call Liberty Garden, a memorial garden, all along the way on this trail. The other thing to point out is it was nice and sunny. If you remember when we were at the pier, I'm only about 2 or 3 miles south of the pier, and fog and mist has rolled in. One of the really unique things here in Northern California, one of the things I love is you can go from beautiful sunny day to a bit of this overcast, but I actually really like it. All right, so here's our first look at the quarry. So this is what's known as a Calera limestone, and the Calera limestone is Cretaceous in age. And so you're talking the time of the dinosaurs. The latest time of the dinosaurs is when all this limestone was laid down. And limestone, of course, is a very popular building material, both for its ability to be sculpted and because you can actually cut it into nice blocks because of how it often fractures. But that's why there is this giant quarry, which we can see in front of me, exists, as they're pulling the limestone out of here for a number of the buildings in San Francisco and the surrounding area. Now, knowing that we're still on the Pacific side of the plates here, the North American plate somewhere on the other side of those hills in the fog and cloud banks over there, that means this material could have come from a couple different places. One is it could have been brought up via strike slip faulting along the San Andreas Fault all the way from Southern California. It definitely came from somewhere south of us because we know the plate side I'm moving on now is moving northwards, right? And the other side, North American plate's moving southwards across those hills. So this came from somewhere to the south. If this is Cretaceous in age, there is the possibility that this was part of when the Farallon plate was subducting against North America before the modern day San Andreas Fault set up, that this could have been deposited somewhere in the ocean vicinity, maybe not quite as far from here, but I'm not too certain. So if anybody actually knows the answer to where this Calera limestone originally came from, how far south, please let me know in the comments below. It definitely has that classic limestone look to it, the gray color. In fact, you'll see it turns a little bit more white or bleach this way, and I'm wondering if that's the material they were actually chasing after. And as I come over this rise, you can really see this quarry now. Pretty neat. The geology in this part of North America is so incredibly complex. You had stuff happening during the time of the dinosaurs. You had oceans out here, and you had a bunch of island arcs slamming in to the western part of North America. You had volcanoes popping off. And then eventually, of course, you set up the San Andreas Fault Zone. So many unique environments from both a faulting, what we call structural point of view, as well as the rocks themselves. So we can see limestone here, but there'll be other areas we're going to see intrusive igneous rocks that came all the way from Southern California and were dragged up here along the San Andreas Fault. Really, really cool story. All right, back to this wonderful limestone. Now, it is really beaten up. And what I mean by that is you can see it's very fractured in this area, which is no surprise with the faulting, but the fractures probably made it easier for the folks who are coming out here first working the quarry to split these in larger blocks or in blocks in general and ship up to San Francisco. Now, I was looking for some fossils. What I can tell is it looks pretty fossil poor. I did quickly read that there were microfossils found in this, and that's how they know the age. So there's some certain assemblages of microfossils that give you an idea that these would have been Cretaceous or during the latest time of the dinosaurs. Now that's really cool. So if you can see here where there's a color change, there's actually a little fracture and or probably a fault zone running right through there. And that's why you see that color change and that unique kind of weathering pattern, smooth pattern on the surface there. And that tells me there's probably a fault or at least a pretty significant fracture system running right through there. And that's what these early quarry engineers would have been chasing after, because if they can get into these cracks, they can break these rocks out with a little bit less energy. Now, you will potentially break them up in a way that you don't want. So that is a risk here. Now, the other thing they could have used this for, some kind of gravel for various things, for landscaping, because it is, at least where they're at today, where they stopped today with the quarrying, is pretty beaten up, fractured. Wouldn't be very well put together. The flowers are out in full bloom right now too. These are gorgeous. Is this really smooth surface right there. So it looks like, I wonder if that's where they're excavating part of this, or it may have also been part of another fracture network. So a lot of times these fracture networks will work in conjugate, so 90 degrees to one another. And so this would have been conjugate to that other fracture system I saw going in that direction. So maybe they were working those to get out the type of limestone they wanted until they eventually ran out of the really nice limestone. The other thing I'll point out is we can see how these are all tilted up on end right here. So when limestone's deposited, it's deposited flat like my fingers. But now these are rotated almost 90 degrees, right? 80, 85 degrees. Pretty amazing, which tells me they had to be caught up in some kind of faulting. And of course we know over those hills and through the woods, no, over those hills on the other side here is where the San Andreas Fault is. So it's no surprise that we see these beds are all on end or almost 90 degrees. Now, what I don't know is what the rocks are on top. There are both what they call a gray wacky, which is a lightly metamorphosed sediment, and there's also basalts that came out here later on, and I'm not sure which those are. I'm not going to be able to get up there to take a look. But if anybody knows, please chime in down below if you've hiked this trail and know about the geology, and please share with us. This was just off the cuff, wanted to come check this out and quickly looked up what information I could. All right, so I did a little bit more digging. According to the geologic map I saw, says it's known as a Franciscan complex. So these are a bunch of ocean volcanoes and volcanics that got scraped on top of this stuff through faulting and through some thrust faults that were going on. And so this is known as the Franciscan melange or Franciscan unit. In fact, what's interesting is they've dated this to the Jurassic to the Cretaceous. So that may actually be older rock over younger rock, or something that may be slightly synchronous, because they have ages from 200 million years all the way to the end of the dinosaurs, 65 million years, whereas the stuff down below was closer to the 100 to 80. Pretty cool spot to come check out. I mean, I left the airport about 2 hours ago, grabbed those sandwiches, went to the pier, and then came down here and found these amazing rock outcrops to share with you all. All right, now to the next stop, which we're going to see if we can get there. There's a place called Devil's Slide where they actually shut down part of the Pacific Coast Highway because there's so much damage on a regular basis because of the landslides along the coast that now it's a hiking trail. What I heard is it's very difficult maybe to park there, but let's go check it out and see if we can go check out Devil's Slide. I moved from the quarry and now we just drove through the tunnel where they had to create the new Highway 1 due to Devil's Slide, and now we're at the Devil's Slide parking lot, which I'll say there's not very many spots there. I got really lucky and got a spot. You'll see it's really a busy and popular hike, especially on a weekend. But what I want to do is turn this around and show you some of the amazing scenery and talk a little bit about the geology. In fact, you can see these cliffs down here. A number of these cliffs look like they're a combination of both some kind of granite as well as maybe some old sandstone. But what's important for thinking about slides and coastal erosion processes for California is you can see the fractures, especially as I zoom in. You can see these fractures here, and as time goes on, these whole cliff faces are going to start falling off into the ocean, which creates the slides. Now, the other really interesting thing to see here is off in the distance over here, there's a World War II bunker that was put in place that would have, this is a place where they can keep an eye on the oceans to make sure none of the Axis powers, Japan, Germany, Italy, were going to try to come across here and try to attack California. And so that's pretty cool that there's a remnant of that lookout. Now, what I don't know, if all that erosion underneath it is post World War II and all natural, or if people actually carved it down so people wouldn't climb into it. That I don't know. But if there's been that much erosion, that's pretty significant because there's people over there, and that's got to be somewhere around 10 to 12 feet of erosion since World War II on this cliff face, which just gives you an idea, if that is the case, how quickly these cliffs are eroding and why you have the big landslides that are coming off of here, slumping into the ocean. So welcome to the abandoned portion, Pacific Coast Highway. This was the road people used to drive on. So I'm actually walking on the Pacific Coast Highway, which is really cool to know this is where cars have been coming for well over 100 years. And the tunnel system up around a decade ago. So that means this was the main thoroughfare for the Pacific Coast Highway up until that point. It's really neat that we can actually walk on this stretch today. Because there's rocks, I have to get up close and personal. Now, I can tell you right away that this is some kind of granite. And I can tell because the quartz crystals here, it's really beaten up. Actually, this is probably more of a gneiss at this point. It's been slightly metamorphically altered. But what's hanging out in here is a lot of the big chunks of quartz, which gives it this appearance. This is probably maybe a diorite or a granodiorite. And what is super cool about this is that this stuff came all the way from the Mojave Desert in Southern California down just east of Los Angeles. So these rocks have traveled a very, very long way over millions of years. So right now we're still on the Pacific Plate, and this piece of the Pacific Plate came all the way from basically the Mojave Desert area of Southern California. And these rocks, you can find their sister rocks down there today, but now we're hundreds of miles away. Pretty cool to think about and really neat to see. What a story and what an adventure rocks have been on. Okay, folks, I just got squirreled. Check this tree out. It's got roots growing down through the rocks. Now, if you all saw my video from Southern California where I went to the San Gabriel Mountains, I actually talked about this phenomena where the trees find fractures for the roots to run through because that's where water is going to run through, right? It's a zone of weakness in the rocks and it's going to filter the water there. So trees take advantage of that, and you can see that this tree is pretty darn healthy because it's taking advantage of the fractures here to get the water. You can imagine driving here, you're top down, cruising between these little hilltops and getting the stunning view. Now, the downside is you can see all this granodiorite on the right-hand side and how fractured and beaten up it is. See all these lines and lineations going through it. These are all ready for disaster in the sense of rock falls. Now, for us walking, we can get out of the way, but if you can imagine a vehicle running through here, it could be a real issue. You can see why they ended up having to close off this section of the road. Like, look at this fault zone running right through there. And you can see where water's accentuated it. And you can see it going all the way up and up and up, all the way up. Indeed, we went across our fault zone where we were in our granodiorite, and now we're into whatever this craziness is here. And I'm not even sure what this is, folks. So I have to get up close. It looks like, well, maybe this is still some kind of granodiorite, but it's really beaten up and discolored, suggesting there's maybe some fluid flow that went through it. See how it's kind of that greenish color? And then there's some pinks in here. And look at this faulted mess. Can everybody see this? Look between these two zones. You can see when everything's been smushed along this fault zone, running right up. And as I continue along here, it's no wonder this was such an engineering nightmare, and why they had to, do that great engineering feat of putting a tunnel through this whole cliff. Because, as we can see off in the distance, all this stuff is primed just to slide right down, because it's on this very broken, fractured material, and this fractured, broken material just needs a little bit of water, a little bit of time, and you're going to have some major landslides. All right, so we've entered the Devil's Slide section as I turn that last corner, and I got to tell you, I think I'd have been a little worried about driving down this on a regular basis as well. And check out that change. So here's our beaten up granodiorites, and then notice the change going across. You can actually see some bedded stratigraphy up there, or rocks, and that tells me there's definitely a change or a fault zone between here and there, and those are probably more sedimentary. All the debris draping over those other rock outcrops. So you can just get an idea about how, with just a little bit of water on these unstable slopes that are very steep, all this would just come crashing down, and it would just knock out this road again and again. Now, I turned around in the middle of this section, so I want to point out the trees and the tower up there. So that tower was a watchtower. In fact, there's a bunker down here where there were individuals, like the bunker we saw earlier, who would communicate back to large guns that were stationed along the Pacific coast here, and they would relay saying, hey, we see enemy ships, here's their coordinates. Now, those lookout stations basically became obsolete right around 1950 because of aircraft. Aircraft could travel farther. Ships couldn't get within range without aircraft finding out and being able to attack them. Now back to the rocks. So as I walk up and look at the stratigraphy here, this looks different than what we were seeing before. And so these look like they're actually a series of sandstones and mudstones, so ancient seabeds. And all these ancient seabeds, you can see here, all these muds, what's interesting about those is that they're very easily eroded, and if they get a little bit wet, they start moving. And so if there's anything heavy or heavier units on top of them, when it gets wet, this whole thing slumps down, takes out the road, and drives it right into the sea. And I guess the name comes from Devil's Slide because it's taking you right on down the slope. Actually, this is a fantastic example of why this is a major risk. This is all water leaching out from underneath these beds. And so that water is coming down, it's coming down, hits some impermeable layer, and then eventually leaks out. But what that does is creates a zone of weakness in this cliff face. And you can see where the resistant rock has less resistant rock, this muddier rock above it. And eventually that all just will continue to slide down and down and down. And we all know the stories now that there's a lot of coastal erosion happening here in California, and landslides are a regular occurrence, really a yearly occurrence here now along the coast of California. And here's a nice look at some of those muddy beds, probably from what I read from just after the time of the dinosaurs. These were all deposited in a deep ocean setting, and that's why they're so fine and dark. Basically a mudstone that would have been deposited somewhere of the equivalent of way out there in the deeper part of the ocean, but they've been brought up due to all the faulting here. And it's worth mentioning, where you see the bare rock, this other stuff's right on top of it, probably sloughed down over this material, and all ends up falling and failing together down the slope. This is another great spot where you can see what looks like maybe old turbidite deposits. So these are sandstones that got deep out in the ocean, but then they're covered by these large beds of mudstones with a little bit of siltstone probably in there, which are the little resistive kind of tan color features you see in there. So these would all been deep water deposits. And again, this just is basically, think of it as like mud that's been lithified. So ancient mud. So when you add water to mud, what happens? Things start to fail. And in fact, you can see over here where the engineers have actually put a cover to try to protect the rocks from falling down on us today, even as we walk here. A really cool view of what deep ocean looks like in stratigraphy that's now exposed. Also along the way, they have all these markers talking about what kind of animals live out here. You'll see, even a great white shark, elephant seals, sea lions, dolphins, harbor seals. And what's interesting is it talks about the Farallon Islands, which way out there somewhere, which we can't see today. But what's fascinating about those, they said somewhere way out here, is that actually marks the low point of the ocean before the glacier started melting. So in other words, all the way in front of me out to the Farallon Islands, tens of miles out there, was all land when the last glacial ice age was at its maxima. Pretty crazy to think about that people would have been living out here and walking out here, the ancient indigenous people, and now it's all under the oceans because of all the ice melting. Absolutely fascinating. Engineers have used chain mail and chain link to protect the trail here, where you can see these large slabs are breaking off, getting a little bit of water in them, and they just tumble down here onto the old Pacific Coast Highway. They have information actually about Devil's Slide, which we're standing somewhere right in here right now. And you can see that is what's behind me here, where they've stabilized this. So it says the slide is about half a mile wide and extends 900 feet from the ridge top to the ocean. Millions of years of upward pressure has broken and weakened the rock of these cliffs. Since 1937, when this section of the highway opened, it's been closed dozens of times due to rock falls and the rock movement. One last thing I want to point out on this board here is where it talks about the granitic rock, which we talked about when we first got here, the sedimentary rock, which we've been looking at, and then there's this thing called the Franciscan complex, which is what we saw on top of the quarry material when we were there. And so you can get an idea that the most dangerous part of this feature is, of course, right here at the sedimentary rock and where this boundary is between the sedimentary rock and the granitic rock. Nice little simplified diagram. Now, what also is cool about this is, if you watch my other videos, I talk about the three rock types, right? There's three rock types or rock families. There's sedimentary, which we see here. There's igneous, which are the granodiorites and granitic rocks. And then there are metamorphics, which is actually your Franciscan complex. So really cool, you have all within a stretch here, all three rock types and rock families, which is pretty unique to have that close together. Of course, the reason they're all close together is a much more complex story, and one we'll save for another day. One other thing I'll point out while we're standing here is you can actually see these rocks sticking out. And what you'll notice is rocks, when they're deposited, are usually deposited flat, and these are all up on end. And that trend continues into the hillside way over here, where we can actually see some of them are folded, telling me again there's a fault zone that's running through this area. And looking at the difference in rocks from there over to here tells me that there must be a fault likely running right through that region. I'll say I'm not an engineer, but I'm always fascinated by how humans have to interact with their environment and how engineers need to find creative ways to try to keep things like landslides and rock falls happening. In this case, the earth eventually won. In fact, as I walk down a little farther, you can see how this is all flat. It looks like they tried to stabilize this part by basically using concrete or cement, but it didn't work either. And they even tried to put a pipe out to try to drain the water from on top of the mountain up here And you'll see the little pipes coming down still, where they're trying to drain as much water out of the soil here and truck it right down into the Pacific. But again, none of those seem to work. And that's why we have this wonderful hiking trail where you can walk a portion of the historic Pacific Coast Highway. All right, now that we've checked out the Devil's Slide, saw a little bit about these natural disasters here in California, now we're going to go take a look at the potentially single most important geologic feature in all of California. We're going to go check out the San Andreas Fault at the San Andreas Fault Trail. I've made it up to the San Andreas Fault Zone, and check out that view behind me. So that valley behind us is actually the fault zone, and you can see the clouds and the mist back there in that spot. I'm really excited to do this hike, share some of the observations about this fault zone and about the 1906 rupture, which apparently we can see some evidence for on this trail. I will say, anybody who ever comes and wants to do this trail, it's absolutely stunning. Look at the clouds rolling in, the sun rising in the background, and the main fault strand comes right down that valley. It comes right in front of us behind this hill, and we're actually going to hike along it on the other side of this fence. So this is called the Los Trancos Open Space Preserve. I went ahead and grabbed a map, so we'll follow this along, and I'm going to look for some markers. One thing I'll point out right now, as we start, is you'll see these white markers. This is marking one of the faults here that are part of the San Andreas fault system. So they've actually marked the line for the fault zone. And you can see they actually have white marks on them. So this shows minor fault traces. And then the main fault trace will be marked with yellow. So it's worth mentioning that most of us think of a fault, or people call them fault lines, as a single strand. However, fault zones are made up of multiple faults. In fact, we call them fault zones as geoscientists because it's not just a single strand. I've got some friends hanging out with me over here, some deer that are there. Hi, deer. That are checking out the fault zone as well. And there's a guide marker. We're going to go the Nonette Honco San Andreas Fault Trail. Although I'm here to check out the geology, I gotta say these trees and this trail and little tree tunnels here are pretty spectacular. As I'm working down some switchbacks down into the valley, this valley that's in front of us, I'm pretty sure is the main strand of the San Andreas Fault. It exists as a valley because the fault's running right down the middle. So there's one hill across the way, and then of course, I'm on the other side of the hill here, and running between us is the fault zone. Look at the trunk of this tree and all this moss. Wow. Oh, I just saw turkeys up here also, but I wasn't able to catch them in time to show you all. I had no idea there were wild turkeys here, or I don't know if they're people's pet turkeys that are running around here, but they're turkeys. I'm working my way down and down like Alice in the rabbit hole here, but instead I'm going to end up in the land of the San Andreas Fault Zone. Well, I found station 3 for this trail, and this is just really talking about this idea of the benches. Now, what's really cool about this is if you look over here, you're going to see the yellow markers, and the yellow markers actually mark where the San Andreas proper is going through. So here's something cool to do. The post is back here. So right now I'm actually standing on the Pacific plate. I'm on the North American plate. I'm on the Pacific plate. I'm on the North American plate. And now the boundary is going right between me, and I'm on the Pacific plate and the North American plate right here. How cool is that? Actually spanning across two of these great plates right along the San Andreas Fault Zone that you can see marked by these posts going behind me. In fact, if I look down here, the fault trace goes right past this fence, right down in this area, and you'll see there's kind of a steep side. There's a little gully and another steep side. So where these faults go through end up being zones of weakness. So water a lot of times will travel down these features. They'll accentuate the fault zones, and erosion will preferentially follow where those paths are of weakness in the Earth's crust, like the San Andreas Fault Zone. So you get a lot of different features that form on these fault zones. There's things called sag ponds, which are long linear ponds that follow that trend. Instead of a pond or a lake being more rounded, they're more long and narrow. and we call those sag ponds. You'll also get what we call these pressure ridges, and that's where portions have been popped up relative to other parts of the fault due to the pressure of movement and little bends and little deformities along the fault. Maybe we'll see some of those. In fact, where I actually walked down was probably one of these little pressure ridges along the fault zone coming through here, which is what these trees are on top of. So we're coming up to a kind of a cool spot that's showing an offset fence. Now, there's lots of pictures showing different kinds of offset of the San Andreas Fault. The San Andreas Fault's what we call a right lateral fault. So let me go to my trusty whiteboard and share that with you now. So here's my trusted whiteboard, Walter, or Walt as I like to call him. And what I've done here is I've drawn two pictures of what are types of strike slip faults. And so this is a bird's eye view. So picture we're looking down onto the earth. And the San Andreas is this kind of fault. So this line represents the fault line. And you'll see I have two arrows with dashes on it. So these dashes at one point would have been together, but now they've moved relative to one another. So imagine if there's a fence across here, and we're going to see an example of that actually on this hike where a fence has been offset right laterally just like this. So we can see relative from one side of the fault to the other, it's moved to the right. So if I'm on this side of the fault looking this direction, it's moved to the right. Conversely, you can have left lateral faults where everything moves to the left of the opposite side you're on. So if I'm standing here looking across, I could see the fence move to the left. So those are the two types of strike slip faults that we talk about. And we're going to look at today the San Andreas Fault Zone, which is a right lateral strike slip fault. I'm looking down the fence line now, and we can see where this fence line is. And if we go over and step to our right, is the next fence line. So what we drew before is the fault would be running right between those two fences. And because the fence line across from us moved to the right, we would call this a right lateral strike slip fault zone. And so you can actually see that offset here along this fence. So it really accentuates that idea of that these fences were all once would have been lined up and now have stepped over. Now, this is an example. They've rebuilt this here so that way individuals can see how much movement's actually taken place along the San Andreas Fault, specifically during that 1906 earthquake. And here I am for scale, and you'll see, I don't know, let's see how far of a walk this is. It's kind of 1 foot, 2 foot, 3, 4, about 4 foot gap here. I know north of us, they had much larger gaps. So during the 1906 earthquake, the energy was starting to dissipate this direction and you didn't have as much offset. Now, where they're showing this offset actually is along one of the more minor faults of the San Andreas Fault. The main San Andreas Fault strand is actually down below us, and that would have had probably a similar amount, maybe a little bit more offset there in the 1906 earthquake. But again, this is just an example of what if the fault moved right here, how much offset you would see on a fence that was once all together that has now been right laterally separated by that strike slip fault zone. You can see where they actually marked one of the minor faults as part of the San Andreas coming right down where this fence is offset. And I'm guessing the main fault zone's down there in the valley. That's why we have a valley down below us. Although it's hard to tell today because we've had rain, there's actually a bunch of water popping up along the fault zone here, creating all this shrubbery that we see here right along the trail. In fact, you can see some of the water here. Although again, we've had rain, there's actually a spring that comes up here. So faults are great places to find water because they're zones of weakness and allow water to come to the surface. So plants love tapping into fault zones because they can get an abundant amount of water in those areas. And this hill that's next to us that gets really steep really fast is along the same strand where we see the offset fence here. And there's a lot of really happy plants running along this where they're tapping into that fault zone to get water easily. All right, we've come to the fork in the road. We're going to our left. I'm going to hike this direction. So here's another marker for the San Andreas Fault. One thing I'll point out is the topography associated with strike slip fault zones is very complex. So we saw where the strike slip fault zones create valleys, they can create ridges, but they can also create these flat zones where they've been filled in and have become stabilized crust or surface because maybe something pulled apart, you had some landslides come in or something else happen, but it actually creates a flat bench as well. It's fascinating to me how these strike slip faults work and their topography. I definitely think they're some of the hardest types of faults to understand. Normal faults are pretty straightforward. There's complications. Thrust faults are pretty straightforward with some minor complications, but strike slip faults you get both normal faults and thrust faults as part of them. You get valleys, you get ridges, you get benches, flat spots. It's just all over the place because of the dynamic movement and the types of rocks they're going through and what's happening with the geography and the weather all changes how you look at these features. Coming up again to the main strand of the San Andreas. So here we go. So right now I'm over on the North American plate. And we see over here, in fact, actually you see there's a tree that fell over. I wonder why the tree fell over, but there's actually the run of the San Andreas goes right through here at this point. Work my way over. This is what we call a sag pond. Even though it's been raining, it's hard to tell, but if we see where the San Andreas Fault runs right through here, there's actually a little low. So there's a bench on the left-hand side, and then there's this little low that forms where water, if there's enough rain, will pool together and create a little pond, but it's linear. It's not as round as we usually think about ponds. It's a long linear pond, and actually you see some beautiful examples of these in Google Earth along the San Andreas Fault in this area, and I'll show those now. And as we can see, as we zoom in along the San Andreas Fault, just north of where we're at right now, we can actually see one of these sag ponds that really is a sag lake along the San Andreas Fault zone. You can see how it's long and linear as opposed to more what we call equant or more circular. And this is a classic definition of what is a sag pond. This would be a nice example of a sag pond, or an area that's opened up during the faulting of 1906 and created this long linear catchment for water. I mentioned earlier about how flora and plants will find these fault zones as zones of weakness and get water. So vegetation tells us a lot about what's happening in geology. And this is a really fantastic spot to look at as well. There's some really unique tree features here that I want to share with you. And if you can see underneath this brush, there's actually a 90-degree angle to this tree. They cored this tree and they found out that it was alive during the 1906 earthquake. And what they think happened is this is the main trunk of the original tree. The tree fell over in the 1906 earthquake. And then the tree branches popping up, they've dated to about 1908. They're doing tree ring analysis. So that suggests that this tree was actually involved in the 1906 earthquake, fell over, but still had enough root strength and was able to start growing upwards, reaching towards the sun again so it could survive. Really cool story, and a snapshot of damage that's still here from the 1906 earthquake. And I will say, quoting Jurassic Park, life finds a way. Here's another nice example of one of those trees that fell over and was working its way up after the 1906 earthquake. This also tells us that 1906 earthquake did indeed come right through this region here. Now we're working our way on the trail down into the adjacent valley, and I am seeing some fault markers down here, but it looks like there's some of the offshoot faults or minor faults to the main San Andreas strand. Sure enough, here are some of those white markers showing a minor strand coming off of the San Andreas Fault, cutting right through and down this path. Is pay attention to the topography. So you have a little hill here, a little low, a little hill. What's interesting about some of these little lows is most of the time when we think about a low along a hillside, it's cutting perpendicular. So it'd be cutting down across it as streams start eroding down into it or water erodes down into it. What's interesting about these is actually they're working parallel to the contour line. So these are these kind of almost sag pond concepts or drainage concepts associated with how the strike slip fault sets up the topography here, which is very different than how we think of water running down a normal mountainside or hillside. As a geologist, we look for these clues, not just the vegetation, not just the topography, but how we think water would run down as well into these areas. And that can give us an idea about maybe what we're seeing for the types of faulting and how we think the fault is moving. We're back at the San Andreas Fault marker, and actually here's another bench. So what happens with this bench is as this stuff's sliding apart, right? And I didn't explain this as well probably up above, but as you slide apart, then it fills in. Then they slide apart and it fills in. There's little gaps. So you slowly can build a bench here if water's not coming through that region. And that's one of the reasons you'll see these flat spots running through this section of the San Andreas. And so here's another post, but that's why you can see it's flat here, because it opens, the cracks open, they fill, they open, they fill. And if there's not water that goes through this, which, as we know, the topography here plays an interesting role, and the fault plays an interesting role, and subsequent small faults all play interesting roles on how water travels. So if the water's missing this area, you can actually create these flat benches from where the faults move through time. Along the San Andreas Fault, so the next question everybody always thinks about is, well, when's the next big one going to occur? We know we had the Loma Prieta one back in 1989, a major earthquake here, major fault movement at that time, and that's southeast of us from where I'm at right now, along this portion of the San Andreas Fault Zone. In fact, I'm walking past a marker right now back here, but we don't know, right? So what we can do is we can work on being prepared. And there's lots of websites out there. There's lots of material on how to be prepared for an earthquake. And it's similar to those of us who live in Houston, where we have to have 5 to 7 days of food prepared in case there's a hurricane, and we have extra batteries because a lot of times we lose power. We know how to shut off our gas. We know how to shut off our water. Those are all important things to know if you're living in this area as well, because emergency preparedness is the same for most natural disasters. Check out those websites. I'll put some down in the descriptions below that you can check out about how to be prepared for earthquakes and what you need. We don't know when the next big one's going to hit, but what we can do is be prepared for it. Main fault zone runs, I think, down that hill from up there, across this topography down to where I was at to the right. Here I'm coming up to a little drainage divide where water is running down here. It's not running right now, but we can see where water runs through, comes out the other side, and runs down the valley. If you're ever in the Silicon Valley area or working up Highway 1 along the Pacific coast, it's about 30-minute drive up to this spot from either side, roughly, and well worth doing. This nature preserve area is absolutely spectacular. And you get to learn about some really cool geology that really does affect everybody here in Northern California, and really across almost all of California, where most of the population centers are all affected by the San Andreas Fault or the subsequent faults related to the San Andreas. And look at that, there's a bench on a fault bench. With this amazing view behind me set up by the San Andreas, I want to thank you all for joining me today and learning a little bit more about the geomorphology and the geology of fault zones, specifically strikes of fault zones. If you haven't already, please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, if you learned something new. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, so you can keep up on all my adventures, learning about geology and history and where those two things intersect with our lives, human lives. So with that being said, thanks again. We'll catch you on the next adventure. Take care.